Section 23 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Place Names the Place, Part 4. When Swann had said to me, in Paris one day when I felt particularly unwell, "You ought to go off to one of those glorious islands in the Pacific. You'd never come back again if you did," I should have liked to answer, "But then I shall not see your daughter any more. I shall be living among people and things she has never seen." And yet my better judgment whispered, "What difference can that make, since you are not going to be affected by it? When Monsieur Swann tells you that you will not come back, he means by that you will not want to come back. And if you don't want to, that is because you will be happier out there." For my judgment was aware that habit which was even now setting to work to make me like this unfamiliar lodging, to change the position of the mirror, the shade of the curtains, to stop the clock, undertakes as well to make dear to us the companions whom we at first disliked, to give another appearance to their faces, to make attractive the sound of their voices, to modify the inclinations of their hearts. It is true that these new friendships for places and people are based upon forgetfulness of the old, but what my better judgment was thinking was simply that I could look without apprehension along the vista of a life in which I should be forever separated from people, all memory of whom I should lose. And it was by way of consolation that my mind was offering to my heart a promise of oblivion, which succeeded only in sharpening the edge of its despair. Not that the heart also is not bound in time, when separation is complete, to feel the anodyne effect of habit, but until then it will continue to suffer. And our dread of a future in which we must forego the sight of faces, the sound of voices that we love, friends from whom we derive today our keenest joys, this dread, far from being dissipated, is intensified, if to the grief of such a privation we reflect that there will be added what seems to us now in anticipation an even more cruel grief, not to feel it as a grief at all, to remain indifferent, for if that should occur, our ego would have changed. It would then be not merely the attractiveness of our family, our mistress, our friends that had ceased to environ us, but our affection for them. It would have been so completely eradicated from our heart, in which today it is a conspicuous element, that we should be able to enjoy that life apart from them, the very thought of which today makes us recoil in horror. So that it would be, in a real sense, the death of ourself, a death followed, it is true, by resurrection, but in a different ego, the life, the love of which are beyond the reach of those elements of the existing ego that are doomed to die. It is they, even the meanest of them, such as our obscure attachments to the dimensions, to the atmosphere of a bedroom, that grow stubborn and refuse, in acts of rebellion which we must recognize to be a secret, partial, tangible, and true aspect of our resistance to death, of the long resistance, desperate and daily renewed, to a fragmentary and gradual death such as interpolates itself throughout the whole course of our life, tearing away from us at every moment a shred of ourself, dead matter on which new cells will multiply and grow. And for a neurotic nature such as mine, one, that is to say, in which the intermediaries, the nerves, perform their functions badly, fail to arrest on its way to the consciousness, allow indeed to penetrate there, distinct, exhausting, innumerable, agonizing, the plaint of those most humble elements of the personality which are about to disappear, the anxiety and alarm which I felt as I lay outstretched beneath that strange and too lofty ceiling, were but the protest of an affection that survived in me for a ceiling that was familiar and low. Doubtless this affection too would disappear, and another have taken its place, when death, and then another life, would, in the guise of habit, have performed their double task. But until its annihilation, every night it would suffer afresh, and on this first night especially, confronted with a future already realized in which there would no longer be any place for it, it rose in revolt. It tortured me with the sharp sound of its lamentations, whenever my straining eyes, powerless to turn from what was wounding them, endeavored to fasten their gaze upon that inaccessible ceiling. But next morning, after a servant had come to call me, and had brought me hot water, and while I was washing and dressing myself and trying in vain to find the things that I wanted in my trunk, from which I extracted, pell-mell, only a lot of things that were of no use whatever, what a joy it was to me, thinking already of the delights of luncheon and of a walk along the shore, to see in the window and in all the glass fronts of the bookcases, as in the portholes of a ship's cabin, the open sea, naked, unshadowed, and yet with half of its expanse in shadow, bounded by a thin and fluctuant line, and to follow with my eyes the waves that came leaping towards me, one behind another, like divers along a springboard. Every other moment, holding in one hand the starched, unyielding towel, with the name of the hotel printed upon it, with which I was making futile efforts to dry myself, I returned to the window to gaze once more upon that vast amphitheater, dazzling, mountainous, and upon the snowy crests of its emerald waves, here and there polished and translucent, which, with a placid violence, a leonine bending of the brows, let their steep fronts, to which the sun now added a smile without face or features, run forward in their goal, totter and melt and be no more. Window in which I was, henceforward, to plant myself every morning, as at the pane of a mail coach in which one has slept, to see whether in the night a long-sought mountain chain has come nearer or withdrawn. Only here it was those hills of the sea, which before they come dancing back towards us, are apt to retire so far that often it was only at the end of a long and sandy plain that I would distinguish, miles it seemed away, their first undulations upon a background transparent, vaporous, bluish like the glaciers that one sees in the backgrounds of the Tuscan primitives. On other mornings it was quite close at hand that the sun was smiling upon those waters of a green as tender as that preserved in alpine pastures, among mountains on which the sun spreads himself here and there like a lazy giant who may at any moment come leaping gaily down their craggy sides, less by the moisture of their soil than by the liquid mobility of their light. Anyhow, in that breach which shore and water between them drive through all the rest of the world, for the passage, the accumulation there of light, it is light above all, according to the direction from which it comes and along which our eyes follow it. It is light that shifts and fixes the undulations of the sea. Difference of lighting modifies no less the orientation of a place, constructs no less before our eyes new goals which it inspires in us the yearning to attain, than would a distance in space actually traversed in the course of a long journey. When, in the morning, the sun came from behind the hotel, disclosing to me the sands bathed in light as far as the first bastions of the sea, it seemed to be showing me another side of the picture, and to be engaging me on the pursuit, along the winding path of its rays, of a journey motionless but ever varied amid all the fairest scenes of the diversified landscape of the hours. And on this first morning the sun pointed out to me far off with a jovial finger those blue peaks of the sea, which bear no name upon any geographer's chart, until, dizzy with its sublime excursion over the thundering and chaotic surface of their crests and avalanches, it came back to take shelter from the wind in my bedroom, swaggering across the unmade bed and scattering its riches over the splashed surface of the basin stand, and into my open trunk, where by its very splendor and ill-matched luxury it added still further to the general effect of disorder. Alas, that wind from the sea, an hour later in the great dining-room, while we were having our luncheon, and from the leathern gourd of a lemon were sprinkling a few golden drops onto a pair of soles, which presently left on our plates the plumes of their picked skeletons, curled like stiff feathers and resonant as citherns. It seemed to my grandmother a cruel deprivation not to be able to feel its life-giving breath on her cheek, on account of the window, transparent but closed, which, like the front of a glass case in a museum, divided us from the beach while allowing us to look out upon its whole extent, and into which the sky entered so completely that its azure had the effect of being the color of the windows, and its white clouds only so many flaws in the glass. Imagining that I was seated upon the mole, or at rest in the boudoir of which Baudelaire speaks, I asked myself whether his sun's rays upon the sea were not a very different thing from the evening ray, simple and superficial as the wavering stroke of a golden pencil. Just what, at that moment, was scorching the sea topaz brown, fermenting it, turning it pale and milky like foaming beer, like milk, while now and then there hovered over it great blue shadows which some god seemed, for his pastime, to be shifting to and fro by moving a mirror in the sky. Unfortunately, it was not only in its outlook that it differed from our room at Combray, giving upon the houses over the way, this dining room at Balbec, bare-walled, filled with a sunlight green as the water in a marble font, while a few feet away the full tide and broad daylight erected as though before the gates of the heavenly city an indestructible and moving rampart of emerald and gold. At Combray, since we were known to everyone, I took heed of no one. In life at the seaside one knows only one's own party. I was not yet old enough. I was still too sensitive to have outgrown the desire to find favor in the sight of other people and to possess their hearts. Nor had I acquired the more noble indifference which a man of the world would have felt, with regard to the people who were eating their luncheon in the room, nor to the boys and girls who strolled past the window, with whom I was pained by the thought that I should never be allowed to go on expeditions, though not so much pained as if my grandmother, contemptuous of social formalities and concerned about nothing but my health, had gone to them with the request, humiliating for me to overhear, that they would consent to let me accompany them. Whether they were returning to some villa beyond my ken, or had emerged from it, racket in hand, on their way to some lawn tennis court, or were mounted on horses whose hoofs trampled and tore my heart, I gazed at them with a passionate curiosity, in that blinding light of the beach by which social distinctions are altered. I followed all their movements through the transparency of that great bay of glass which allowed so much light to flood the room. But it intercepted the wind, and this seemed wrong to my grandmother, who, unable to endure the thought that I was losing the benefit of an hour in the open air, surreptitiously unlatched a pane and at once set flying, with the bills of fare, the newspapers, veils, and hats of all the people at the other tables. She herself, fortified by the breath of heaven, remained calm and smiling like Saint Blandina, amid the torrent of invective, which, increasing my sense of isolation and misery, those scornful, dishevelled, furious visitors combined to pour on us. To a certain extent, and this at Balbec gave to the population, as a rule monotonously rich and cosmopolitan, of that sort of smart and exclusive hotel, a quite distinctive local character. They were composed of eminent persons from the departmental capitals of that region of France, a chief magistrate from Cayenne, a leader of the Cherbourg bar, a big solicitor from Le Mans, who annually, when the holidays came round, starting from the various points over which, throughout the working year, they were scattered like snipers in a battle or draftsmen upon a board, concentrated their forces upon this hotel. They always reserved the same rooms, and with their wives, who had pretensions to aristocracy, formed a little group, which was joined by a leading barrister and a leading doctor from Paris, who on the day of their departure would say to the others, "Oh yes, of course, you don't go by our train. You are fortunate you will be home in time for luncheon." "Fortunate, do you say? You who live in the capital, in Paris, the great town, while I have to live in a wretched county town of 100,000 souls? It is true, we managed to muster 102,000 at the last census, but what is that compared to your 2.5 millions? Going back, too, to asphalt streets and all this bustle and gaiety of Paris life." They said this with a rustic burring of their R's, but without bitterness, for they were leading lights each in his own province, who could like other people have gone to Paris had they chosen. The chief magistrate of Cayenne had several times been offered a judgeship in the Court of Appeal, but had preferred to stay where they were, from love of their native towns, or of obscurity, or of fame, or because they were reactionaries and enjoyed being on friendly terms with the country houses of the neighborhoods. Besides, several of them were not going back at once to their county towns. For inasmuch as the Bay of Baalbec was a little world apart in the midst of a great world, a basket full of the seasons in which were clustered in a ring good days and bad, and the months in their order, so that not only on days when one could make out Rivebelle, which was in itself a sign of coming storms, could one see the sunlight on the houses there while Baalbec was plunged in darkness. But later on, when the cold weather had reached Baalbec, one could be certain of finding on that opposite shore 2 or 3 supplementary months of warmth, those of the regular visitors to the Grand Hotel whose holidays began late or lasted long, gave orders, when rain and fog came and autumn was in the air, for their boxes to be packed, and embarked and set sail across the bay to find summer again at Rivebelle or Costa d'Or. This little group in the Baalbec Hotel looked with distrust upon each new arrival, and while affecting to take not the least interest in him, hastened all of them to ply with questions their friend the head waiter. For it was the same head waiter, Jaime, who returned every year for the season, and kept their tables for them, and their good ladies, having heard that his wife was expecting, would sit after meals working each at one of the little things, stopping only to put up their glasses and stare at us, my grandmother and myself, because we were eating hard-boiled eggs in salad, which was considered common, and was not in fact not done, in the best society of Alencon. They affected an attitude of contemptuous irony with regard to a Frenchman who was called His Majesty, and had indeed proclaimed himself king of a small island in the South Seas, inhabited by a few savages. He was staying in the hotel with his pretty mistress, whom, as she crossed the beach to bathe, the little boys would greet with 3 cheers for the Queen, because she would reward them with a shower of small silver. The chief magistrate and the barrister went so far as to pretend not to see her, and if any of their friends happened to look at her, felt bound to warn him that she was only a little shop girl. But I was told that at Ostend they use the royal bathing machine. Well, and why not? It's on hire for 20 francs. You can take it yourself if you care for that sort of thing. Anyhow, I know for a fact that the fellow asked for an audience when he was there with the king, who sent back word that he took no cognizance of any pantomime princes. Really, that's interesting. What queer people there are in the world, to be sure. And I dare say it was all quite true, but it was also from resentment of the thought that to many of their fellow visitors they were themselves simply respectable, but rather common people who did not know this king and queen so prodigal with their small change, that the solicitor, the magistrate, the barrister, when what they were pleased to call the carnival went by, felt so much annoyance, and expressed aloud an indignation that was quite understood by their friend, the head waiter, who, obliged to show proper civility to these generous, if not authentic, sovereigns, still, while he took their orders, would dart from afar at his old patrons a covert but speaking glance. Perhaps there was also something of the same resentment at being erroneously supposed to be less and unable to explain that they were more smart, underlining the fine specimen with which they qualified a young blood, the consumptive and dissipated son of an industrial magnate, who appeared every day in a new suit of clothes, with an orchid in his buttonhole, drank champagne at luncheon, and then strolled out of the hotel, pale, impassive, a smile of complete indifference on his lips, to the casino to throw away at the baccarat table enormous sums, which he could ill afford to lose, as the solicitor said with a resigned air to the chief magistrate, whose wife had it on good authority that this detrimental young man was bringing his parents' grey hair in sorrow to the grave. On the other hand, the barrister and his friends could not exhaust their flow of sarcasm on the subject of a wealthy old lady of title, because she never moved anywhere without taking her whole household with her. Whenever the wives of the solicitor and the magistrate saw her in the dining-room at meal-times, they put up their glasses and gave her an insolent scrutiny, as minute and distrustful as if she had been some dish with a pretentious name, but a suspicious appearance, which, after the negative result of a systematic study, must be sent away with a lofty wave of the hand and a grimace of disgust. No doubt by this behavior they meant only to show that if there were things in the world which they themselves lacked, in this instance certain prerogatives which the old lady enjoyed and the privilege of her acquaintance, it was not because they could not, but because they did not choose to acquire them. but they had succeeded in convincing themselves that this really was what they felt, and it was the suppression of all desire, for of all curiosity as to forms of life which were unfamiliar, of all hope of pleasing new people, for which in the women had been substituted a feigned contempt, an artificial brightness, that had the awkward result of obliging them to label their discontent satisfaction, and lie everlastingly to themselves, for which they were greatly to be pitied. But everyone else in the hotel was no doubt behaving in a similar fashion, though his behavior might take a different form, and sacrificing, if not to self-importance, at any rate to certain inculcated principles and mental habits, the thrilling delight of mixing in a strange kind of life. Of course, the atmosphere of the microcosm in which the old lady isolated herself was not poisoned with virulent bitterness, as was that of the group in which the wives of the solicitor and magistrate sat chattering with impotent rage. It was indeed embalmed with a delicate and old-world fragrance, which, however, was none the less artificial. For at heart the old lady would probably have found in attaching herself, and, with that object, recreating herself, the mysterious sympathy of new friends, a charm which is altogether lacking from the pleasure that is to be derived from mixing only with the people of one's own world, and reminding oneself that one's own being the best of all possible worlds, the ill-informed contempt of outsiders may be disregarded. Perhaps she felt that were she to arrive incognito at the Grand Hotel, Balbec, she would, in her black stuff gown and old-fashioned bonnet, bring a smile to the lips of some old reprobate, who from the depths of his rocking-chair would glance up and murmur, "What a scarecrow!" Or still worse, to those of some man of repute, who had, like the magistrate, kept between his pepper and salt whiskers a rosy complexion and a pair of sparkling eyes such as she liked to see, and would at once bring the magnifying lens of the conjugal glasses to bear upon so quaint a phenomenon. And perhaps it was an unconfessed dread of those first few minutes, which, though one knows that they will be but a few minutes, are none the less terrifying, like the first plunge of one's head under water, that this old lady sent down in advance a servant, who would inform the hotel of the personality and habits of his mistress, and cutting short the manager's greetings, made, with an abruptness in which there was more timidity than pride, for her room, where her own curtains substituted for those that draped the hotel windows, her own screens and photographs set up so effectively between her and the outside world, to which otherwise she would have had to adapt herself, the barrier of her private life, that it was her home, in which she had comfortably stayed, that travelled rather than herself. End of section 23.